My next guest is Tyla Farley. Tyla is an associate at our clinic who has a special interest and training in working with neurodivergent children and adults. She has a diagnosis of ADHD and is here to share her lived experience with ADHD with the hope that it might provide insight or support to other individuals, couples, or families who are navigating neurodivergence. Welcome, Tyla. It's so great to have you here with me today. Thank you so much for being brave enough to come and speak about your experience. I know, it's not easy for everybody, and I just so appreciate you coming to share with us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So when did you get your diagnosis, and what was the diagnosis, and were there any comorbidities? Which, for the listener, if you're not sure what that means, just means that you might have two or more diagnoses at the same time.
Yeah, so for me, I got my ADHD diagnosis about a year ago, maybe a little over a year. However, I do have a comorbidity of anxiety, and I was diagnosed with anxiety probably when I was around 11. And so obviously at the time, we didn't know I had ADHD. And so, I lived my life from 11 till about 23, just having anxiety with no knowledge of having ADHD.
I'm curious why you think it took so long to get a diagnosis for you.
Great question. So I think it's important to note, ADHD often looks very different in women than it does males. And that often happens too throughout childhood. And so, we think of the kids in class and boys being kind of the hyperactive part of ADHD, whereas females often show in the inattentive side of ADHD. And so for me, I didn't have a hard time sitting still or interrupting teachers or anything like that. So I kind of went under the radar. Whereas for me, my ADHD really showed up in procrastination. And so my teachers didn't really notice that because it wasn't at school that it was showing up.
Right. Okay. And so in retrospect, I'm curious, did getting the diagnosis have you see your childhood experiences in a different way or make sense of them in a different way? And if so, how?
Yeah. So I definitely have. I remember lots of times family and friends having kind of conflict with them because of things that I did because of ADHD. And of course, at the time, we didn't know that. So in retrospect, I'm able to look back and think, oh, hey, this experience where, maybe I left all of my homework till the last minute and my friends were working on it for 2 weeks. And there was this frustration of maybe I got better grades and they knew I waited until the last minute, and that would often, cause conflict in our friendships. And so in retrospect, looking back, I think, if there had been the knowledge of, Tyla does this for a reason, it might have provided greater insight.
Okay. And so I'm hearing procrastination was a big symptom of your ADHD. And I guess I'm curious to know more about that because I think many kids procrastinate, but for you, it sounds like it was a bit beyond that or necessary even for you to be able to produce work. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, exactly. So, even now, it's kind of always been this way in my life, but if I would start an assignment early, I couldn't get it done. I would just sit there and stare at it and be like, I don't know where to start. Versus, if I waited until the last minute, it was like my stress responses and, I was eager to get it done. I knew I had to get it done. And so all of a sudden, all these thoughts would come to me and I'd be able to get my homework done. And so I think, I wasn't able to produce work and to produce things to hand in unless it was last minute.
So there was something about waiting till the last minute and feeling that stress response that sort of kicked you into focus mode in order to produce the work that you needed to get done.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you're saying, I mean, I imagine it would cause conflict with family members and teachers and all kinds of things. Were there other ways that you, in retrospect, see that ADHD was showing up for you and causing distress?
I think, difficulty focusing at times. I remember times where I would come home and my parents would expect me to do homework. And it would be like, I'm not doing this right now. I can't do this right now. There would be times where I would pull all-nighters just to get homework done for the next day. And that was challenging for my parents, for everyone, I think.
So do you think that your ADHD and anxiety are connected in some way, or do you feel like they're completely separate?
For me, I think they are connected. I think back to childhood, and there were times where I felt really anxious because I felt like I wasn't doing what I needed to be doing. And so when I think of that, I think of, this idea of masking in our society. And, masking is really big, is really trying to be someone who fits in with the societal norms as a neurotypical. And so trying to fit into the standards of being neurotypical. And so when I think of that, I think there were lots of times where I tried to fit into the neurotypical way of being. And so I'd try to do my homework early, or I'd try to start my homework 2 weeks beforehand to try to fit in with friends. Or, if we were at study dates, I would try to do my homework at these study dates, and I just couldn't. And so I think there was a lot of anxiety in the fact of, am I doing this right? Do I look different? Am I fitting in? And so I think there was a lot of anxiety about that.
I can imagine. And so what was it like getting a diagnosis? Did you find it helpful or hindering?
Yeah, when I think of getting a diagnosis and I think of, the path to getting a diagnosis, it was a long path, I'll be honest. When I got my anxiety diagnosis at, age 11, I didn't really have much of a say in it. I think it just kind of happened, and the doctor diagnosed me with it, and that was it. And I didn't know better at 11. And then as I got older and I thought I wanted to be in a certain career field, I was more nervous about getting a diagnosis because I was afraid of how that would impact my job.
Like, as in, like, your higher ability?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was very worried. We think of maybe working in corrections or working as a police officer or something like that. And they do psych evaluations to hire you on. And so I was so worried about being labeled or diagnosed with something that I didn't want to get a diagnosis. And so I put off getting diagnosis for years. And then finally, I'm doing my master's program to be a therapist, and I'm like, okay, I can be me at this point. So when I was in my master's program working towards becoming a therapist, I felt more able to be who I am as a person. And so, I talked with my therapist. I'm in therapy, and I talked with her, and I said, I think it's important that I look at this and I look at getting a diagnosis to better understand who I am, how I can show up in my work, how I can show up in finishing my assignments in my master's program, all of those things. And, she was so supportive of me getting my diagnosis. And so that's kind of the trail I went on getting my diagnosis. And once I had my diagnosis, it felt like, oh my goodness, there's so many answers. Like, it all makes sense, Can you say more about that, about what made sense for you once you had that diagnosis? Yeah, I think when we were talking earlier about being in, like, looking in retrospect, there was a lot of things where I sat down with my mom in specific, and I said, Mom, like, think of the times when I was pulling all-nighters, and, think of the times when I had such a hard time focusing, think of the times when I had challenges with friends, think of the times when my teachers were like, you don't have your assignments done, or, and I also think, there was a sense of, I had a hard time staying organized sometimes. And this was a really big piece in my life. And I worked so hard. We were talking about masking. I worked so hard to be organized that, I had color-coded systems. I had, certain folders had to be certain colors. Certain folders had to have certain things in it. And I remember being in public school and we would have our weekly desk cleanouts. And, our desks had to be a certain way, and my desk was not organized in the certain way that the teachers wanted it to be, or, my room wouldn't be organized in the way my parents would want it to be, but it felt organized to me.
Exactly. So it was organized for you in the way that you needed it, but not necessarily how maybe a neurotypical person might consider organized.
That's right.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So I'm curious, it sounds like you've found it helpful to get a diagnosis. Am I getting that right? Mm-hmm. And lots of times there's misconceptions about neurodivergence and it being a disability explicitly. And I'm not trying to minimize the challenges that people with neurodivergence face. I am curious, though, if you feel like ADHD has given you any sort of superpowers, or there's been any benefit to you that you can identify that maybe other people don't see or recognize.
Yeah. I think one of the big things is we have to ask why. We have to be curious. And so, why is somebody doing what they're doing? When we think of neurodivergency, we don't think of, well, that person, we need to eliminate those behaviors. That's not it. We're asking, why do they have those behaviors? And so when I think of it being a superpower, I think of, I was able to do things in a way that felt good for me. And I think what's important to recognize too is that there's different ways to get to the same goal. And so there's different pathways that we can take to all get to the same ending, and that's okay. And I think that that's important in looking at neurodiversity and looking at, individuals who are neurotypical. We don't all have to do things the exact same way to still get to the point we want to get to.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you feel like ADHD has helped you in your life?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things is I'm able to kind of have my own systems. When I look at other people, I think, oh my goodness, I could never do it that way. And I think that that's amazing for them. But then I think of myself and I think the amount of sticky notes that I buy and the color-coded systems I have and all the highlighters I have. And, I think I found my own strategies in how I'm able to cope and how I'm able to kind of live my life in a way that feels good for me. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important when we look at anyone. It's what feels good for you.
Mm-hmm. It also sounds like, based on what you shared earlier, that even though procrastination is typically seen as negative, that somehow for you, it gave you some kind of superpower to produce a lot of work and really well at the same time. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I remember a specific time in high school and we were working on this project and my friends had been working on it for weeks. And we had been doing study dates and I was kind of just on my phone doing my own kind of thing at these study dates, and they'd often be like, Tyla, like, you're distracting us. And I'd be like, I'm sorry. But then I would do it last minute. And I remember a time when we had handed in our assignments. My one friend had worked on it, like I said, for weeks, and I had did mine the night before, and she knew that. And when we got our grades back, and I had gotten a higher grade than her, it caused a lot of conflict between us. And there was this thought of, well, you shouldn't have got a higher grade because you did it last minute and I did mine sooner. Mm-hmm. And, that still stands out to me because, in what works for us doesn't mean that a result is going to be predetermined.
Exactly. And so I guess I'm curious, having learned all of this and getting a diagnosis and making sense of your experience in a new way, has it impacted your experience of anxiety?
Yeah, I think it has. there are ways of, I remember, like I said earlier, of feeling like I had to fit in or I had to mask to be a certain way. And now, I don't have those feelings as much. I'm able to be myself and I don't have to worry, am I showing up in a way that is neurotypical, or am I showing up in a way that other people are going to be like, that's not okay, right?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Like, am I going to meet the expectations of acting neurotypical and all of that? Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so are there supports that you wish that you had as a child that you think would have made a significant difference in your life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think for me, and I do a lot of work with kiddos and parents and things. And I think what's important for me is, again, the why. Why is that child playing with things in their hand? Why is that child unable to sit still? Why is it this way? And when I look back at my own childhood, I think of the times when we were always told, crisscross applesauce, hands in the basket when we were sitting on the carpet. And our legs had to be, crossed and our hands had to be in our lap and we had to be looking at the teacher. And, I think what's important is we don't need to have visual cues to be able to listen auditorily. And so, we can still listen and not be looking you in the eyes. We can still be fidgeting with something and still be listening and understanding. And so I think in retrospect, I wish there would have been a greater understanding back then. And obviously, I'm mindful that we only knew what we knew back then, and our parents were only doing the best that they could with what they had. And so I'm very mindful of that, but I think there's still ways to go. And I think there's still, an understanding that parents and teachers need now. And how does that look for them? And how does that look for their...
I'm so glad you brought up the topic of masking, because it's something that has come up a lot in my practice more recently and among my friends who have recently been diagnosed. And the idea, or when I think about it, the stress involved with having to literally put on a mask in order to feel like you're fitting in, and the energy that would take for someone on the everyday, and the impact of that on mental health more broadly sounds pretty big.
Yeah. I will add something to that is, when I was a kid, I would be great at school. My behavior would be amazing. My teachers wouldn't have any problems. But I'd be exhausted when I got home because I had masked all day long. And so when I got home, I had so many behaviors. And, my poor mom had to deal with so many of those behaviors. And, my dad, I would mask a lot with my dad. So I was typically kind of better behaved for my dad. But I was exhausted from masking. And so home was where my behaviors came out. And I think that's an important topic to even have with your kids, is like, what is making you feel so tired when you get home? Or, how have you been all day? And looking at those differences.
Well, it comes back to that idea we were talking about around curiosity. I think that behavior has traditionally just been seen as a lack of discipline. And I'm not saying that certainly there aren't places where that's happening, or maybe there's trauma happening. Nonetheless, being curious about what it is that's happening for a child when they're acting out or they're emotional or having difficulties is so important, so that we can understand how to best support them in those moments. And I can, even in my own experience with my son who has autism and ADHD, can remember so many times where he would come home and just be fried. But that fried showed up in this whirlwind tornado of energy that just needed to be released from everything he had been containing throughout the entire day. And it was confusing and hard because it would just sweep through our house and impact all of us. And I know from friends who also have diagnoses that talk about masking and how they have to use it every day, and to what degree that is just so exhausting and depleting for them. And I was recently reading something about masking burnout, which seems to be an emerging concept in the field around the type of burnout that neurodivergent folks can end up facing from having to continually mask all the time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes me think, how do our systems that are in place change, right?
Right. What's the solution? Mm-hmm. So, part of me, when I think about it and I take a step back and think about like what's happening here, and, through listening to other people's lived experiences along with, other research, it sounds like, there's this idea that folks who are neurodivergent have to fit into this neurotypical world, which is very much socially constructed, right? Like, even if as a neurotypical, if I go somewhere in the world, somewhere else, like let's say China, the social norms there are very different. And what seems socially appropriate to me might not seem socially appropriate to them. So social norms are very much socially constructed in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But the expectation for neurodivergent individuals is to fit with whatever that construction is, which, promotes or invites masking and then, anxiety and all these other things that we have to contend with.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those social norms are very, very old.
Exactly. Like, due for an update, maybe.
That's right.
Yeah, I think, and it's woven through all of our systems too, which isn't helpful. Like, there's, norms at school, norms at home, and it's a tough balance because even as a parent who has a child with ADHD and autism, I'm constantly having to navigate that line between helping him engage in ways that are quote unquote socially appropriate without feeling like I'm trying to change him into something that he's not. Not just, it has nothing to do with people and how they view me in parenting or making judgments about my son and what I must be doing as a parent if he can't do X, Y, Z. But because for him, he's a 13-year-old kid who's looking to connect and be social. And, unfortunately, he's caught in this place where he has to feel like he needs to kind of move a little bit in order to connect. And so, I don't want to make things harder for him. I also don't want to change him. It's just like it's a real tough bind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like you're walking a tightrope.
I'm walking a tightrope all the time. And I mean, I don't know, even as a therapist, the best way to always navigate it. It's really hard. Mm-hmm. I try to stay open and we talk about it and things like that. But at the end of the day, these systems are in place, these norms are in place, and we can work towards changing them. And I think that's important. In the meantime, we're walking a tightrope.
That's right. Yeah.
So after having sort of identified some of the challenges that you've experienced, and I know others have experienced who have a diagnosis, what do you think is important for change? How can we support individuals, couples, families in navigating this in a way that feels more healthy and provides better quality of life?
Mm-hmm, yeah. I think, for me, what's important is I feel really privileged in being a therapist and having the ability to connect with clients who are also experiencing similar things. I think the biggest thing is being curious, providing that curiosity, asking the why, wondering what's going on versus, trying to formulate an opinion yourself. So I think that's a big piece. I think the other big piece is allowing there to be different ways. So, we can maybe show up in a way that allows for creativity or allows for, outside of the box thinking, that maybe neurotypicals wouldn't kind of bring to the table to begin with. For me in my practice, I use a lot of art. I use a lot of play. I'm working towards becoming a play therapist right now. And the ways that play shows up in therapy is so important. And that's for individuals who've experienced trauma. That's for individuals who are neurodivergent. It's a big scale of who that is helpful for. But I think it's allowing there to be other ways versus one social normative way.
Yeah, you had mentioned before that there are so many ways to get to the goal. It doesn't have to be one path to any one goal, and everyone is going to respond differently to different paths. And so it's up to us to be curious around which path feels like the best fit. And part of that, I imagine, is psychoeducation. So, the more we know, the more we can support and the more we can show up for our loved ones. I think it's also important in our field to be informed so that we can show up for our clients in those ways and be affirming to neurodivergence. And because in order to help, we need to understand what it is that they're struggling with.
Yeah, and checking in on that, right? Like, instead of thinking that, we're right in our ideas, it's checking in. How is this landing for you? Does this sound right?
Does it resonate?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I completely agree. And so how important would you say early intervention is for folks? And what should people do if they feel like they are maybe neurodivergent or their child is neurodivergent? What would you say would be important there?
Yeah, I think in looking back, there's a part of me that wishes my parents would have gotten me into therapy a bit sooner. I think that I wish that I would have had more understanding, more psychoeducation. I think, again, at the time, my parents were doing the best that they had with the information that they had. And now, 20 years later, I think we have a lot more information. And so I think, taking the time to really digest that information, to learn from individuals who are neurodivergent, I think that's important. And I think, finding a therapist who works well with you, resonates with you is important. I've been through many of therapists. My therapist now, she's neurodivergent, and that has been a really big piece for me in my journey, even in getting diagnosed.
Mm-hmm. Right, because you feel like they can relate and you feel understood, which is part of the power of therapy. I mean, therapy can be so powerful when someone feels seen, recognized, understood by another individual. Mm-hmm. And so for us to, be able to do that for neurodivergent people is as important as it is for us to do it for neurotypical people as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Tyla. This has been so informative. I am so happy that you came to share your experience with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great being here.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you want to contact us at New Roots Therapy, you can reach us at our website at newrootstherapy.com. Or if you'd like to reach out to Tyla directly, you can reach her at info@newrootstherapy.com. Thanks again, and stay tuned for our next episode.